Eleanor spent the next morning watching her guests from behind her sunglasses on the deck. Melissa's family was already sprawled across her lounge chairs like they owned the sun itself. Patricia, the matriarch, floated lazily on an inflatable swan in the pool, barking orders about sunscreen reapplication. Kevin and his girlfriend blasted music loud enough to send gulls screeching from the dunes. Eleanor didn't say a word. She observed, catalogued, and stored everything for later. Every insult, every assumption, every moment of disregard was a brick in the wall she was building. When Brandon arrived later that afternoon, wearing mirrored sunglasses and a grin that didn't reach his eyes, Eleanor was ready. "Mom, this is amazing," he said, kissing her cheek as if the last conversation hadn't included subtle threats about nursing homes. "Everyone's settled in, I see." "I see that too," she replied evenly. "You certainly wasted no time." He laughed like it was all a misunderstanding. "It's just for a couple of weeks. You'll love having company. It's good for you. You shouldn't be alone so much." Eleanor smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. "You're right, dear. I won't be alone for long." That evening, while Melissa's family commandeered her dining room for a shrimp boil that had somehow turned into a karaoke party, Eleanor sat in her office with a glass of Merlot and a folder labeled contingency. Inside were copies of documents she'd quietly updated with her attorney that morning. The ownership of the house had already been moved from her personal name to a newly formed limited liability company, EJ Holdings LLC, with a board of one, herself. The move had taken less than an hour. Her son and his wife believed she owned the house outright. Technically, she didn't anymore. The company did, and the company had policies, strict ones, about unauthorized occupants. By the next morning, the locks had been changed. When Melissa's brother came back from a beach run and found his key no longer working, chaos erupted. Melissa stormed into Eleanor's office, face flushed with indignation. "Eleanor, what's going on?" "None of our keys work." Eleanor looked up from her laptop calmly. "Oh, I had the locks rekeyed. Standard security procedure for corporate properties." "Corporate properties?" Melissa echoed, frowning. "Yes," Eleanor said, taking a sip of coffee. "The house now belongs to EJ Holdings LLC. I'm just an employee here, and according to the occupancy policy, only authorized guests with signed liability waivers are allowed overnight access. It's a safety thing." Melissa blinked. "You can't be serious." "I assure you I'm entirely serious," Eleanor said. "But don't worry. I'll give everyone 24 hours to complete the required paperwork." Behind her calm voice, her eyes glittered. The first move had been made. Brandon looked up from his phone with the expression of a man who has just realized the depth of the hole he's been digging. His hair was still damp from a hurried shower, his shirt wrinkled, his voice tense. "Mom, we have a problem," he began, his tone slipping from forced politeness to panic. "Oh." Eleanor stirred her coffee slowly, watching the dark swirl reflect the morning light. "Only one problem? I'd assumed there were several. This catering bill, Tom Morrison's company says it was ordered under my name, with my credit card number. But I never authorized that charge. I didn't even know about it until this morning." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's odd. I distinctly remember hearing you tell several guests that you were hosting the event. Surely the host pays for his own party." Melissa's voice cracked in disbelief. "You mean you set us up? You made us look ridiculous in front of everyone." Brandon's colleagues were there, his potential investors. Eleanor set down her coffee. "Oh, on the contrary. You both looked magnificent. The perfect hosts of a lavish evening. The kind of people who can afford a $15,000 celebration without blinking. Congratulations. You've finally learned to live the image you've always sold." Melissa flushed, her anger rising. "You're cruel." "I'm disciplined," Eleanor corrected softly. "There's a difference." For the next 2 hours, the house was filled with whispered arguments and frantic phone calls. Brandon's credit card had indeed been used. Eleanor hadn't needed to do anything illegal. She'd simply arranged with Tom's company to process the payment through the same card number Brandon had used weeks ago to help with the furniture delivery. He'd authorized it, then promptly forgotten. Typical. By mid-afternoon, the once bustling house had turned quiet. Melissa's parents were avoiding Eleanor's gaze, Her sister had packed early for an impromptu trip to the mainland, and Kevin and his girlfriend were suddenly too busy to stay another night. The energy that had filled the house just a day earlier now hung heavy with unease. Eleanor spent the afternoon reorganizing her study, humming softly as the tide whispered outside. When Brandon finally approached her, his expression was part contrition, part calculation. "Mom, look," he began. "I get that you're upset. Maybe we overstepped. But you can't keep doing this. It's not healthy." Eleanor turned, one eyebrow arched. "Doing what?" "Playing these games," he said. "You've always been controlling. Ever since Dad left, everything's been about power with you. The company, the money, the house, it's all about who wins. And you can't seem to stop." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You're right, Brandon. It is about power. The difference is I earn mine. You inherited the illusion of it." He exhaled sharply, trying to rein in his temper. "I'm worried about you, Mom. You're not the same. Maybe you need someone to help manage things for you." "I was actually talking to Melissa's father about—" "About what?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to slice through his sentence. "About taking over some of the financial responsibilities," he said quickly. "Just until you're back on your feet. You've done so much. You deserve to rest. We can handle things now." Eleanor felt the same cold fury she'd known years ago during boardroom betrayals and shareholder coups. He wasn't offering help. He was staging a takeover. "Rest," she repeated slowly, tasting the word. "Is that what you call it when you push someone aside and strip them of everything they've built?" Brandon's face tightened. "That's not fair." "Neither is life," Eleanor replied, her tone calm again. "You'd know that if you'd ever actually faced it." That evening, she placed one more call to her attorney, Sarah Chun. "Sarah," she said when the woman picked up, "I'm going to need a new contract drafted. A rental agreement for the beach property." "Rental? I thought you lived there." "I do," Eleanor said. "But as of tomorrow, it will be listed as an exclusive executive retreat. Private, invitation only. Anyone staying here will be paying market rates, up front, in writing, and without exception." Sarah paused. "Including your son. Especially my son." The next morning, Brandon came downstairs to find a crisp, white envelope on the dining table. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the letterhead of EJ Holdings, LLC. Notice of temporary tenancy, it read. Occupants, Brandon and Melissa Sterling. Term, 14 days. Rate, $1,500 per day, payable in advance. Failure to remit payment will result in immediate termination of access and removal from the property. At the bottom was Eleanor's elegant signature. When Melissa read it, she laughed, high and brittle. "This is insane. She can't just start charging us rent." "She can," Brandon muttered, scanning the document. "If it's technically company property, she can." Melissa's mouth tightened. "Then maybe it's time we talk to your lawyer. About power of attorney, maybe even capacity issues. She's acting irrationally." Eleanor's voice floated from the doorway. "You'll find that proving irrationality requires more than discomfort, my dear. Though I imagine you'll have plenty of that soon." The couple turned. Eleanor stood there in a pale linen dress, the morning sun at her back, looking less like an aging retiree and more like the woman who once ran a multi-million-dollar empire. "Eleanor, you can't be serious," Brandon said. "We're family." "Exactly," she said. "And family should respect boundaries. You've mistaken kindness for weakness for too long." She handed him a small envelope. "Consider this your receipt." Inside was a printed invoice marked past due. The following days were a study in discomfort. Melissa's family, sensing tension, quietly excused themselves. Her parents left under the guise of early flights. Her sister texted an apology that sounded suspiciously relieved. Soon only Brandon and Melissa remained, rattling around the massive house that no longer felt welcoming. Eleanor maintained her usual calm routine, morning walks, afternoon tea, late-night reading, but the house itself began to shift subtly. Internet access required new logins. Cable subscriptions vanished. The thermostat responded only to her code. On the third morning, Brandon confronted her in the kitchen. "Mom, did you cut off the Wi-Fi?" Eleanor looked up from her crossword. "Oh no. EJ Holdings simply switched to a corporate plan. You're welcome to access it through the guest portal for a small daily fee. Melissa's jaw dropped. You've lost your mind. Eleanor smiled. Not at all. I've simply regained control. That afternoon, a sleek black SUV arrived. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, carrying a leather folder. Miss Sterling, he asked politely. Eleanor nodded. You must be Mr. Hughes from the property management company. He handed her several documents. Everything is ready. We'll begin advertising the retreat next week. And per your request, all existing occupants must vacate the premises within 72 hours. Brandon froze. Vacate? You're evicting us. I'm following procedure, Eleanor said. EJ Holdings values order. You'll find the terms clearly outlined in the agreement you declined to sign. Melissa's face turned pale. Where are we supposed to go? There's a lovely coastal motel about 10 miles down the road, Eleanor said kindly. They offer free breakfast and Wi-Fi. You'll feel right at home. That night, long after the lights were out, Eleanor stood on the deck listening to the waves crash below. The air smelled of salt and victory. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt something quieter. Not sadness, something heavier, more complicated. Brandon had been her greatest investment and her most painful loss. Somewhere between funding his dreams and forgiving his failures, she'd forgotten that love doesn't mean surrender. Now, she had reclaimed herself, but as she watched the last traces of moonlight shimmer across the ocean, Eleanor wondered if the cost of peace was loneliness, and whether, after everything, it was a price she was still willing to pay. Eleanor Sterling sat in her sunlit kitchen sipping coffee from a porcelain cup patterned with blue hydrangeas. Outside the window, the Atlantic shimmered with that impossible early morning stillness that comes only after a storm. The air smelled of salt and renewal, but inside her house, the atmosphere was thick with tension and leftover resentment. The echoes of the previous night's party still lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of expensive wine and forced laughter. She had endured worse storms than this. When her husband Charles died 3 years earlier, Eleanor discovered that grief was not a single crashing wave but an unending tide. It receded only to return again, reshaped and disguised. She thought she had survived the hardest part until her son Brandon came back into her life with his bright ideas, his management plans, and his hollow assurances that it was all for her benefit. Now, sitting at her kitchen table in the aftermath of his latest disaster, Eleanor finally understood what Charles had meant when he warned her that entitlement was a quiet disease that destroyed from within a family. She had ignored the signs at first. It began with Brandon suggesting she host more gatherings at the beach house to keep herself social. Then came the business luncheons disguised as family dinners. By the time he proposed converting her retirement home into a family-run networking hub, the infection had spread. Everyone wanted a piece of her, the house, the money, the peace she had carved out for herself after a lifetime of service to others. Last night's dinner party was the breaking point. $15,000 for lobster and champagne, all charged to her account. Brandon had justified it as an investment in family legacy, while his wife Melissa posed for photos on the terrace, captioning each one as if she already owned the place. Now, the fallout had arrived in the form of legal threats and a polite young attorney standing on Eleanor's doorstep with a folder full of accusations. Rebecca Walsh had the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Her hair was sleek, her voice calm, her eyes the color of winter glass. Mrs. Sterling, she began evenly, our concern is simply your well-being. These sudden property transactions can sometimes be indicators of undue influence or impaired judgment. Eleanor almost smiled at the irony. She had spent 40 years managing a family business beside a man who built empires from nothing. She had balanced books, negotiated contracts, and understood leverage better than most corporate executives. Yet here stood a woman half her age, implying she was incapable of managing her own life. Impaired judgment, Eleanor repeated slowly, letting the words roll off her tongue like unfamiliar seasoning. Is that what my son told you? Ms. Walsh hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. Eleanor gestured toward the patio. Would you like some tea? It was a habit she couldn't shake, the automatic civility of a woman raised to host, to soothe, to maintain appearances even while the world burned around her. Outside, Gulls screamed overhead as she poured tea from a silver pot into fine china cups. Ms. Walsh accepted hers politely, though she didn't drink it. Eleanor studied her guest. She saw the professionalism, the quiet discomfort, the underlying doubt. She knew Ms. Walsh wasn't a villain, merely a tool in her son's latest campaign of manipulation. "Tell me," Eleanor said gently, "how long have you been practicing law?" 8 years, the attorney replied cautiously. "Then you must know that accusing someone of elder abuse without evidence is a dangerous strategy. It can ruin reputations, cost licenses, and destroy relationships." Ms. Walsh blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I don't mean to intimidate you, my dear. I simply want to be sure you understand what you're being used for." For the first time, the young woman's expression softened. "I'm only doing my job, Mrs. Sterling." "Of course you are," Eleanor said. "And so am I." She handed Ms. Walsh a slim envelope. Inside were neatly printed copies of every relevant document, the LLC transfer papers, notarized authorizations, bank confirmations, and a legal declaration signed and witnessed the previous morning. Every irregularity her son had imagined was already accounted for. Ms. Walsh leafed through the documents, her brows tightening slightly with each page. By the end, her voice was quieter. "Everything appears in order." Eleanor leaned back, her eyes steady. "Yes, it usually does when one actually reads." The lawyer exhaled slowly, then set down her cup. "If I may be candid, Mrs. Sterling, your son seems to believe you've been isolated, that you've been manipulated into decisions that don't align with your best interests." Eleanor's laugh was soft but edged with steel. "My dear, the only manipulation happening here is my son convincing himself that he's entitled to what he never earned." Ms. Walsh nodded slowly. There was respect now in her gaze, reluctant, but real. "I'll advise him to withdraw the claim." "That would be wise." The conversation ended with polite farewells, but after the door closed and Eleanor was alone again, she allowed herself a long, trembling breath. Even for a woman as composed as she was, it was exhausting to be both the victim and the strategist, the wounded and the warrior. She turned her gaze to the ocean. The morning tide shimmered with the same indifferent rhythm as ever, eternal and patient. Eleanor whispered to the sea, "He thinks this is over." It wasn't. Not even close. Brandon's betrayal wasn't just about property. It was about power, a son's attempt to strip his mother of agency, to turn her into a dependent in her own life. And Eleanor Sterling was not a woman who surrendered easily. Later that afternoon, she made a series of quiet phone calls. One to her financial advisor in Raleigh, another to her attorney, a trusted friend named Margaret Chun, and finally, one to the county records office to verify something she already suspected. Within an hour, confirmation arrived. Brandon had filed a claim requesting an injunction to freeze the LLC transfer. He was doubling down. Eleanor's pulse steadied. She felt no fear, only a cold clarity that reminded her of her younger days, the nights she stayed up with Charles reviewing business contracts line by line while he dozed beside her, trusting her to see what he missed. She still remembered his last words before the heart attack took him, "Don't let them make you small." She hadn't, and she wouldn't now. That evening, as the sky bruised purple over the water, she opened a locked drawer in her desk and retrieved a flash drive labeled Sterling Holdings 2014 to 2020. Inside was every record of the family's financial dealings, including transfers Brandon had made without authorization years earlier, small amounts at first, then bolder as he realized no one was watching. Eleanor had kept quiet at the time, choosing peace over confrontation. But peace, she now realized, had been a luxury she could no longer afford. She poured herself a glass of wine and began drafting a letter. Not to Brandon. Not yet. To Rebecca Walsh. If Brandon wanted a legal war, Eleanor would give him one, and she'd make sure his own evidence became the weapon that buried him. She typed steadily, under the hum of the ceiling fan. Her reflection mirrored faintly in the window. Some storms, she thought, aren't meant to be weathered. Some are meant to cleanse. And this time, Eleanor Sterling intended to emerge from it not as the victim of betrayal, but as its reckoner. The morning after Mike's report arrived, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder spread before me like an autopsy of my son's moral decay. Each document, each photograph, Each neatly stapled record told a story of greed, deception, and incompetence. It was one thing to be betrayed by your child. It was another to realize he'd done it for something as pedestrian as debt. Brandon hadn't acted out of hatred or necessity. He'd acted out of entitlement, the belief that he deserved my security because his own failures were someone else's fault. That was the part that stung most deeply. I called Sarah Chin. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "I'd like to initiate legal action." There was a brief pause. "Against your son. Against anyone who attempted to defraud or exploit me. If his name appears in that category, so be it." Her tone shifted, less gentle, more professional. "Then we'll do it by the book. Conservatorship fraud, attempted financial exploitation, malicious reporting to a government agency, and potential defamation. We'll let him drown in his own paperwork." That phrase made me smile. Drown in his own paperwork. There was a poetic symmetry to it. By noon, Sarah's office had filed formal complaints with the North Carolina Department of Justice and Adult Protective Services, this time naming Brandon as the potential abuser. It was a legal inversion, so perfect it bordered on art. The very agencies he tried to weaponize against me would now investigate him. But I wasn't finished. That afternoon, I made another call, this time to a local journalist I'd worked with years ago on a corporate ethics investigation. Her name was Dana Ruiz, a sharp, relentless woman who had built her reputation exposing white-collar corruption in small towns. "Dana, it's Eleanor Sterling." A pause. "Eleanor Sterling? As in Sterling Dynamics, Eleanor." "The same. I've got a story you'll want to hear. It involves elder financial abuse, attempted fraud, and a very stupid man with my last name." Dana laughed softly. "Send me what you have." I didn't send everything, just enough to pique her interest. The fake real estate emails, the catering invoice, and the transcript from my conversation with the social worker. Within hours, she called back. "This is unbelievable," she said. "He really tried to put you under a conservatorship. He tried to sell my house before that. Would you be willing to go on record? I insist on it." By the next morning, the story was on the front page of the Outer Banks Chronicle. Local entrepreneur accused of targeting mother in elaborate financial scheme. Evidence suggests attempted property fraud, false reports to social services. The photo beneath the headline was one of me taken years ago at a charity gala. I looked poised, confident, untouchable. Brandon, meanwhile, looked anything but. By noon, his name was trending on local social media. His business website crashed under the weight of negative reviews. Former clients began publicly sharing their grievances, including late payments and creative accounting. I received a text that afternoon from an unknown number. "Mom, how could you do this to me? You've ruined my reputation." I replied simply, "No, Brandon. You did that yourself. I just turned on the lights." 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Brandon's attorney, the same as Walsh who had once smiled so confidently in my living room. The tone had changed. Our client wishes to avoid further escalation and proposes mediation to resolve outstanding misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. The word was almost charming in its absurdity. I forwarded it to Sarah Chun. "Tell them to submit a formal apology, public retraction, and reimbursement for my legal fees. Then we'll talk." But behind the satisfaction, a deeper ache had begun to settle in. I couldn't ignore the quiet truth that every victory came at a cost. I'd raised that boy. I'd once held his feverish head against my shoulder and whispered lullabies to chase away nightmares. Somewhere along the line, those lullabies had turned into warnings he never heard. Still, I reminded myself, guilt was a luxury reserved for those who hadn't been betrayed. A week passed. The Pattersons' rental ended, replaced by a new family, quiet, respectful, grateful. The property management company continued to send steady payments. My life was returning to the rhythm I'd built. Coffee at sunrise, paperwork before noon, the ocean whispering through open windows at dusk. Then one evening, just as twilight painted the sky in soft bruises of purple and gold, headlights appeared in my driveway. I knew that car. Brandon stepped out, wearing the same navy blazer he'd used for client meetings. But the swagger was gone. His hair was unkempt, his eyes shadowed. He stood there for a long moment before walking up the steps to the porch. "Mom," he said quietly. I said nothing. "I just want to talk." The air smelled of salt and storm. A squall was coming in from the ocean, and I wondered if it was coincidence or divine timing. "You've made your point," he continued. "I get it. I screwed up. But this is too far. The whole town's talking about me. Melissa's left. I lost 2 clients this week." I folded my arms. "Actions have consequences. I told you that when you were 10 years old." He swallowed hard. "Can't we just start over?" "I was just trying to protect the family's interests. You're not getting any younger." I laughed then. A sharp, cold sound that startled even me. "You're still doing it. Still pretending it was about protecting me instead of stealing from me." He flinched. "Do you know what real protection looks like, Brandon?" I said softly. "It looks like the years I spent building a company so you could have a debt-free education. It looks like the mortgage I co-signed when you couldn't qualify on your own. It looks like every time I bailed you out, thinking you'd finally learned your lesson. That was protection. What you did was predation." He looked at the floor. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the boy he used to be. Then it was gone. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I just didn't think you'd fight back like this." "That was your first mistake," I said. He left without another word. I watched his car disappear into the storm, headlights swallowed by the rain. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph, just a quiet certainty that I had survived something intended to break me. But the story wasn't quite over. The next morning, Sarachin called. "Eleanor, you'll want to sit down for this." Apparently, during the ongoing investigation, the district attorney's office had taken an interest in Brandon's financial activities. Several of his clients had filed independent complaints: embezzlement, falsified invoices, tax evasion. The local paper's story had triggered a chain reaction. "They're building a criminal case," Sarah said. "You won't need to testify unless you want to." I looked out at the ocean, sunlight glinting on the waves like broken glass. "No," I said after a long pause. "Let the evidence speak for itself." As it turned out, the evidence spoke loudly. By the end of the month, Brandon was indicted for fraud and financial misconduct. Melissa filed for divorce shortly afterward, citing irreconcilable differences and public humiliation. I didn't attend the court hearings. I didn't need to. The newspaper headlines told me everything I needed to know. That night, as I sat on my deck under the stars, I realized that the war was truly over. I had won, but like all victories fought in the name of survival, it left behind a hollow echo where love used to be. Eleanor Sterling had protected her home, her autonomy, and her dignity. But in doing so, she had buried the last traces of the woman who once believed family could be trusted simply because they shared her blood. And somewhere in the quiet between the waves, I whispered the truth I could never say aloud. The morning after Mike delivered his report, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and reread the file twice, slowly letting every detail settle like sediment in water. Each page confirmed what I already suspected. Brandon and Melissa were drowning financially and looking for a lifeline that would not come from their own effort. I had always believed that entitlement was a kind of disease, but seeing it documented in bank statements and eviction notices made it feel clinical and undeniable. Mike had even uncovered an email thread between Brandon and a mortgage officer at a small bank in Raleigh, where Brandon had written confidently about his mother's expected decline in capacity and the timing of estate transition. The words made my stomach twist. He wasn't just greedy, he was planning my demise as though it were a business strategy. That was the moment I stopped thinking of him as my son and started viewing him as an adversary. I called Sarachin again that afternoon and laid the file on her desk. "I want to move forward," I said. "With what exactly?" she asked, though I could tell from her tone she already knew. "Everything. Power of attorney revocation. Cease and desist letters. Asset protection restructuring. I want him cut out of every legal and financial access point." Sarah smiled faintly. "You've always been thorough, Eleanor." "This time," I said, "I intend to be surgical." Within 72 hours, every account that had once listed Brandon as an emergency contact or beneficiary had been updated. My attorney filed formal notices revoking any previously granted financial authority. The property management company received new instructions with explicit language prohibiting disclosure of information to any family member without my written consent. I didn't just shut the doors. I sealed them. Then I started working on his undoing. I didn't lose a son. I finally saw who he really was. The first step was subtle. Mike helped me draft an anonymous complaint to the State Licensing Board for Design Professionals outlining concerns about potential fraudulent billing and misuse of client funds. Brandon's small design firm had a history of sloppy bookkeeping and one angry former client willing to talk. It was enough to trigger an audit. The second step was more personal. Through public record requests and social media sleuthing, I discovered that Melissa had been selling luxury handbags and jewelry online using photos taken in my guest room mirror. Many of those items had been gifts charged to my credit cards the previous summer. I forwarded screenshots to the fraud department of the issuing bank. By the end of that week, their joint accounts were frozen pending investigation. But I wasn't done. A month earlier, I had quietly installed high-resolution security cameras throughout the property after Brandon's first visit. They captured everything that happened during his stay, including his drunken argument with Melissa about locking down the house before the old woman changes her will. That recording would be useful later, though I didn't yet know how. For now, I wanted to watch them squirm. 2 weeks later, Brandon called again, his voice brittle with controlled anger. "Mom, this is ridiculous. My accounts are frozen, and someone has been making anonymous complaints to my office." "That sounds terrible," I said evenly. "You must be under a lot of stress. Don't play games with me. I know you're behind this." "I think you give me too much credit, Brandon. Perhaps you should review your own choices." "You've gone too far," he said. "I'm serious, you're going to regret this." "I already regret something," I replied quietly. "I regret raising a man who thinks his mother's destruction is a path to prosperity." Then I hung up. That night I took out the flash drive containing the security footage and placed it in my safe beside the binder labeled contingency. For the first time in weeks I slept soundly. But peace never lasts long in a war of pride. 3 days later Sarah called. "Eleanor, there's something you need to know. Brandon has filed a petition for emergency guardianship. He's claiming you're suffering from cognitive decline and need oversight for your safety." For a moment I couldn't breathe. He actually did it. "Yes. There's a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. Then we'll give them a show," I said. Those 2 weeks became the most meticulous preparation of my life. I gathered every invoice, bank statement, and property document neatly organized in color-coded folders. I compiled witness statements from the Pattersons and other tenants attesting to my competence and professionalism. Sarah arranged for a neuropsychological evaluation conducted by a respected specialist who concluded I had exceptional cognitive function for her age. When the day of the hearing arrived, I wore a navy suit sharp enough to cut glass, and my late husband's watch polished to a quiet gleam. The courtroom was small, the air too cold, the kind of sterile space that magnifies silence. Brandon sat at the petitioner's table looking tense and sleepless. His lawyer, Ms. Walsh, was beside him, expression unreadable. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Brandon's side argued that I had made erratic financial decisions and was being manipulated by outsiders. They referenced my LLC transfer and rental business as complex schemes beyond her ability to manage. Then Sarah stood. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we intend to demonstrate that Mrs. Sterling is neither incompetent nor confused. She is a retired business executive who continues to manage multiple properties successfully and has documented evidence of her son's attempts at financial coercion." One by one, Sarah presented the exhibits. The catering bill, the real estate calls, the fraud alerts, the video clip where Brandon could be heard saying, "Once she's under guardianship, the house is ours." The courtroom went silent except for the soft click of the playback stopping. Brandon's lawyer objected half-heartedly. The judge simply said, "Objection overruled." By the time Sarah finished her closing statement, there was no doubt left. The petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled on the same grounds. As we exited the courtroom, Brandon refused to meet my eyes. Melissa followed him, looking pale and frightened. For the first time I saw cracks in their arrogance. Outside, Sarah turned to me. "You won, Eleanor." "No," I said quietly. "Not yet." That evening I returned home, poured a glass of wine, and stared out at the ocean. Winning in court was only the surface victory. What I wanted now was something deeper, more final. I wanted them to feel what it meant to lose everything they had tried to steal. The next phase of my plan would make sure of that. The weeks that follow the courtroom confrontation were strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't simply fill a house but settles into the bones. For the first time in months, there were no phone calls, no legal threats, no unexpected visitors claiming to be checking on my well-being. The silence was a gift, and I guarded it fiercely. Sarah Chin kept me informed of the legal progress. The restraining order was granted without resistance. Brandon's attorney withdrew from representation after learning of the harassment evidence. The district attorney's office had opened an investigation into the false Adult Protective Services report. The machinery of accountability had begun to move, and it moved with the slow, unstoppable weight of truth. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was something deeper. A weary kind of clarity. Winning had never been about revenge, or even justice. It had been about survival. About refusing to be erased from my own life. Mike Santos's final report arrived in a sealed envelope delivered by courier. I poured a cup of coffee and opened it on the deck overlooking the sea. The summary was clinical but devastating. Brandon and Melissa had filed for bankruptcy. The catering company had won a judgment for the unpaid party bill. Their home was listed for foreclosure. Every bridge they had tried to burn me with had collapsed beneath their own feet. I read the report twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside. There was no satisfaction in his ruin, only a quiet acceptance that consequences are the shadow that follows choice. A week later, Sarah called. "Eleanor, you should know Brandon reached out again. Through an intermediary. He wants to apologize." I stared out at the water, thinking of the boy he once was. The boy who had believed I could fix anything with enough love, patience, and late-night talks. "Tell him I accept his apology. But I do not wish to see him." There was a pause. "I'll note that in the record," she said softly. That evening I walked along the shoreline barefoot, letting the cold Atlantic foam wrap around my ankles. The stars came out one by one, pale and unhurried. I thought about Harold and the legacy of control he had passed on to our son. I thought about every woman who had been told she was too old, too fragile, too naive to manage her own life. I thought about the cost of peace and realized I had paid it gladly. 2 months later, the beach house hosted its first wedding. The Patterson family's eldest daughter married beneath an arch of white lilies on the sand while the sun dipped low over the horizon. They insisted I sit in the front row as an honored guest. When the young couple exchanged vows, I felt something ease inside me, like a wound finally closing. After the ceremony, Mrs. Patterson hugged me. "This place has a soul," she said softly. "It feels loved." I smiled because she was right. The house had been built with hope and defended with fire, but now it had become something better. A sanctuary for people who valued peace. Late that night, after the guests had gone, I sat on my deck again, the ocean dark and endless before me. My phone buzzed once more. A text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry, Mom. I hope you're happy." For a long moment I stared at the words, then typed my reply. "I am. I truly am. Take care of yourself, Brandon." I turned off the phone and set it aside. The wind carried the faint sound of waves breaking, and somewhere far out at sea a boat's light flickered like a heartbeat. The world was vast again, and it belonged to me. In the months that followed, the beach house flourished. The management company handled bookings, the guests left glowing reviews, and I discovered new friendships among travelers who returned year after year. My days were simple, filled with sunrises, coffee, and the comforting rhythm of the tide. Sometimes I still thought of Brandon. Not with anger, but with a kind of distant compassion reserved for people who never learned the difference between love and control. Perhaps one day he would understand. Perhaps not. But either way, I was free. Freedom is not the absence of pain. It is the quiet certainty that no one else will ever write your story for you again. And as the dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the world in gold, I whispered to the sea what I had learned the hard way. Peace is not something you inherit. It is something you earn.